The icy wind howled through the mountains, carrying sharp snowflakes that sliced against Hannah Walker's exposed skin. She pulled her tattered coat tighter around her, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. Night was falling faster than she had hoped, and the blizzard was closing in. Hannah lived alone in a small wooden cabin nestled deep in the Alaskan wilderness. As a survival guide, she led thrill-seeking tourists who wanted to test their limits against the unforgiving land. But in winter, when the snow buried the trails and tourists disappeared, she relied solely on her survival skills to make it through. Today, she had ventured farther than usual, desperate to gather enough firewood before dark. As she swung her axe against a dead tree branch, she heard a faint, pain-laced moan, barely audible over the wind. Hannah froze, her pulse quickening. There it was again. It wasn't her imagination. She turned, scanning the white expanse around her, and then she saw it, a dark figure half buried beneath the snow. Her chest tightened. Out here in the middle of nowhere, a man lay unconscious in the freezing cold. If she didn't act, he wouldn't survive the night. Without hesitation, Hannah rushed toward the stranger, unaware that this single decision would alter the course of her life forever. Hannah knelt down, her hands trembling as she brushed away the snow covering the man's body. His skin was deathly pale, his lips nearly blue, and his dark hair was frozen at the edges. The clothes he wore were expensive, but now they were torn and soaked through. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck. His pulse was faint but still there. "Can you hear me?" she called, shaking his shoulder lightly, but all she got in response was a weak, pain-filled groan. Hannah clenched her jaw. If she left him here, he was as good as dead, but dragging an unconscious man through the thick snow wouldn't be easy. "All right, come on." She hooked his arm over her shoulders and pushed herself up. He was heavier than she expected, but Hannah wasn't the kind of person to give up. Step by step, she struggled forward, dragging him through the storm. The wind was relentless, biting at her exposed skin, but she didn't stop. Only when she saw the faint glow of her cabin did a flicker of relief settle in her chest. Summoning the last of her strength, she yanked the door open and hauled him inside, slamming it shut against the howling wind. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace washed over them, a stark contrast to the frozen wilderness outside. Hannah wasted no time, grabbing a thick blanket and wrapping it tightly around him before checking his injuries. His right leg was in bad shape. A deep gash ran along his shin, dried blood crusted against the torn fabric of his pants. Her stomach tightened. If it got infected, he wouldn't make it. Rushing to the kitchen, she boiled water and grabbed her medical kit. As she gently pressed a warm cloth against the wound, he let out a faint groan, his eyelids fluttering open slightly. Hannah leaned in, her voice firm and steady. "I don't know who you are, but if you want to live, you need to work with me." She had no idea that the man she had just saved was about to change her life in ways she never imagined. Daniel Carter woke up to a deep, aching pain radiating through his body. The small wooden room was dimly lit, the fireplace casting flickering shadows against the aged log walls. The scent of smoke, pine, and something warm filled the air. "Well, you're finally awake." The voice made him turn his head. In the corner of the room, a sharp-eyed woman with chestnut brown hair stood with her arms crossed. She didn't look relieved or pleased, just wary. Daniel opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. "Where am I?" "My house," she replied curtly. "I pulled you out of the snow before you turned into an ice sculpture." Daniel frowned, trying to recall what had happened. Faint flashes of a blizzard, bone-chilling cold. Then nothing. "I don't remember," he admitted, frustration tightening his chest. Hannah gestured toward his leg. "You messed up your leg pretty bad. I patched it up, but if you're not careful, it'll get infected." Daniel studied her. No one had ever spoken to him like this. Direct, blunt, with no admiration or fear. In the days that followed, he had no choice but to rely on Hannah as he recovered. At first, all he could do was lie in bed, watching as she went about her daily routine. She woke before dawn, stoked the fire, boiled water, checked traps, and chopped firewood. She never stopped moving. Daniel, who had once commanded billion-dollar deals from the comfort of his penthouse, now had nothing to do but sit uselessly, and he hated it. One day, he forced himself up and hobbled to the door. "What are you doing?" Hannah's voice was sharp. "I want to help." She arched an eyebrow. "You ever chopped wood before?" Daniel gave a sheepish smile. "Does hitting golf balls count?" Hannah sighed, handing him an axe. "All right, go ahead." Daniel lifted the axe, aimed at the log, and swung. The blade barely made a dent, getting stuck halfway through. Hannah let out a quiet chuckle. "You don't have to hit it like it just robbed you." Daniel clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to failing, especially not in front of a woman. Taking a deep breath, he readjusted his grip and tried again. This time, the log split cleanly in two. Hannah nodded approvingly. "Not bad. Now do that 50 more times." Daniel groaned, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had actually accomplished something real. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of the biggest transformation of his life. In the days that followed, Daniel grew stronger. His legs still ached, but he could now move around the cabin without Hannah's help. She noticed the change in him. He wasn't the same clumsy outsider from the first day. Now, he fetched water, chopped wood, even tried learning how to check the traps. But one question still lingered in her mind. Who was he really? One night, as they sat by the fire, Daniel fell into a heavy silence. His gaze was fixed on the flames, his brow furrowed, as if trying to piece together a broken memory. Then, suddenly, it hit him like a bolt of lightning. Hannah noticed his hands clenching into fists. "Daniel?" He looked up, his expression laced with shock. "I remember." She didn't speak, just waited. "I used to be an investor," he said, voice rough. "I own a financial firm, Carter Holdings. I came to Alaska for a business deal, a gold mine." Hannah frowned. "A gold mine?" Daniel nodded. "One of the last untouched reserves in the region. I spent months negotiating the acquisition." He swallowed hard before continuing. "My assistant, Mark Sullivan, he betrayed me." Hannah tilted her head. "What did he do?" Daniel let out a hollow laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I remember we were at a lodge near Fairbanks. Mark poured me a drink and told me the deal was nearly finalized. I took a sip, and then," he paused, his fingers tightening into his palm. "I felt dizzy, my vision blurred, then everything went black." Hannah blinked. "He drugged you?" Daniel nodded. "When I woke up, I was outside, abandoned in the middle of a blizzard, with no phone, no ID, nothing." Hannah studied him carefully. She had thought he was just another wealthy man who had lost his way, but now his story was something far more dangerous. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked. Daniel looked up, his stormy gray eyes filled with cold determination. "I have to go back. If I don't, Mark will take everything I built." A strange unease settled in Hannah's chest. She didn't want to stop him, but deep down, she couldn't deny it. She didn't want him to leave. What she didn't know was that this goodbye would change both of their lives forever. The sky was a dull shade of gray the next morning, the air heavy with the promise of another snowstorm. Hannah stood outside the cabin, arms crossed, watching as Daniel prepared to leave. As he climbed onto the sled, he looked back one last time, his gaze lingering on the small cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney, and the woman who had saved his life. A strange ache settled in his chest. He was going back to his world, but why did it feel like he was leaving home behind? He was bundled in a thick fur coat, one she had lent him, and leaned slightly on a wooden cane to ease the strain on his injured leg. He still walked with a limp, but he was strong enough now. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. "I don't have a choice." Hannah pressed her lips together, then gestured toward the sled dogs she had prepared for him. "They know the way to town. Just let them lead." Daniel hesitated before stepping closer, as if there was something else he wanted to say, but instead of speaking, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver pocket watch, pressing it into her hand. "This belonged to my father," he murmured. He always said it would help me find my way home." Hannah stared down at the watch, something unexplainable tightening in her chest. She clenched it in her fist, but when she looked back up at him, her expression remained firm. "Then you better figure out where home really is." Daniel exhaled slowly, then gave her a small nod. There was nothing left to say. He turned away, climbed onto the sled, and, with a sharp command, the dogs took off, pulling him away from the cabin and into the vast white wilderness. Hannah stood there, watching until he disappeared into the snow. She didn't realize she had been gripping the watch so tightly that her fingers had gone numb. She also didn't realize this wasn't the end. New York gleamed with lights, skyscrapers towering high, streets bustling with people who had never known the kind of cold Daniel had endured. Stepping out of the black SUV, he felt a strange sense of detachment. A few weeks ago, this was the only world he had ever known. Now, it felt alien in the worst way. Mark Sullivan had taken over his office, running the company as if it had always belonged to him, but Daniel wasn't the kind of man to surrender without a fight. As he strode into the high-rise building, the room fell silent. Stunned faces turned toward him. The man they thought was dead had returned. Mark's expression turned ghostly pale as Daniel pushed open the boardroom doors. "Surprised?" Daniel's voice was icy. What followed was anything but easy. Daniel spent days gathering evidence, contacting trusted allies, and setting a trap for Mark. When he finally confronted him in the boardroom, Mark's face paled. "I thought you were dead," he stammered. Daniel smirked coldly. "You should have made sure." The evidence was presented, the board members turned against Mark, and within hours, security escorted him out of the building. Yet, as Daniel stood in his luxurious office, staring at the skyline, he realized he no longer cared about power. This world, the designer suits, the multi-million-dollar deals, none of it mattered anymore. A few weeks later, instead of rebuilding his empire, Daniel founded the Walker Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to helping rural communities, providing infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Then, he sent a letter to Alaska delivered by a trusted messenger. Inside, there was only one line: "I kept my promise. I'll wait for you." Hannah clutched the letter in her hand, her heart pounding. She had never expected Daniel to actually write. After weeks of silence, she had convinced herself that he had returned to his old life, forgotten everything about Alaska, but now he was still waiting for her. The flight to New York felt surreal. As she stepped off the plane, she hesitated for a moment, gripping the silver pocket watch Daniel had given her. The towering buildings loomed over her, the noise of the city a stark contrast to the quiet of the Alaskan wilderness. She had spent years navigating blizzards and wild terrain, yet here, surrounded by glass and steel, she felt lost. What if he had changed too much? What if she no longer recognized the man she once saved? A car was waiting, taking her to a luxurious hotel. When the elevator doors slid open at the top floor, Daniel was already there. He was no longer the broken man she had dragged from the snow. He wore a tailored suit, his hair neatly styled, but his eyes, they were different now, softer, real. "Hannah," his voice was deep, steady. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Why did you call me here?" Daniel studied her for a long moment before simply saying, "So, you could see the man I've become?" Hannah didn't answer, but as she looked into his eyes, she realized perhaps this world was no longer just his. Hannah sat across from Daniel in the lavish hotel suite, but instead of feeling impressed, she only felt out of place. "You say you've changed." She placed the letter on the table. "But words aren't enough." Daniel tilted his head, studying her. "So what do you want me to do?" Hannah took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "Prove it. Not here, in Alaska." Daniel went still for a moment before slowly nodding. A few weeks later, he returned to the place where he had nearly lost his life. This time, not as a lost man, but as someone determined to belong. He learned to build a fire without a lighter, to hunt without a grocery store nearby, to split wood not for exercise, but for survival. It was difficult, but he never complained. One night, as they stood by the river, the northern lights shimmering above them, Daniel turned to Hannah. "Can I stay?" His voice was steady, more real than any promise he had ever made before. Hannah held his gaze for a long moment, then smiled softly. "You can." And for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter had found a place where he truly belonged. Winter slowly gave way to spring, the thick snow beginning to melt, revealing the first hints of green beneath. Daniel stood by the riverbank, the same place where he had once told Hannah he wanted to stay. But this time, he had a different question to ask. Hannah stepped beside him, pulling her coat tighter against the lingering cold. "You look nervous today," she teased. Daniel took a deep breath, then turned to her. "I've lost a lot of things in my life," he said quietly, "but I never want to lose you." Hannah blinked, silent. Then Daniel knelt down, pulling out a simple silver ring, one he had crafted himself. "Will you marry me?" Hannah studied him for a long moment before letting out a soft laugh. "Are you sure? Life out here isn't easy." Daniel smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." Hannah's lips curled into a smile as she extended her hand. Then, yes, in the wilds of Alaska, where two people from different worlds had once met in the heart of a snowstorm, they had found the most precious thing of all, a home in each other. Daniel's story wasn't about losing an empire, it was about rediscovering himself. And Hannah, who had once believed she was just an ordinary woman living in the wilderness, realized that she hadn't just saved a man's life, she had saved a lost soul. Because sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't what we own, but the people we choose to hold on to.